Hello, and welcome to my personal YouTube channel. What I would like to talk about today is linguistic bias and language learning. And to start off with, we usually think of bias in relation to social issues. And I do have something to say about that a little later in the video. But overall, that is not exactly the kind of linguistic bias that I'm talking about today. What I want to talk about instead is how our native language shapes the way we view languages in general and the ways that that can hinder us from learning a second language. And I think that's the best place to start. Our native language, the language that we learn first as a child, shapes how we view languages and how we view how languages should be. We often, for example, think of the rules for our language, for our native language, as being logical, and the rules for other languages as being, frankly, a little bit silly at first. I know that I went through this, so I'm going to give you some concrete examples that I've experienced in my language learning journey. When I first learned Esperanto, it's a very simple language with a very robust sort of grammar. And what we mean by robust is it doesn't need a whole lot of helper verbs. We can use them in certain cases, as we do with most languages. But in Esperanto, we use cases very straightforward. We have past, present, future, and that's not it, actually. There's imperative and there's conditional, but for practical purposes, they don't have the present continuous and past perfect that we have in English. And at first, it makes it sound a little like like I said, like a little silly, like you're not really saying the whole thing. But here's the thing. If I were to say to you, I swim now, that's grammatically wrong in English, but linguistically, it tells you the information you need to know. It tells you what I'm doing right now. So why don't we use the present simple tense to state what we're doing at the moment? We just don't. We use the present continuous. We say, I am swimming. But there's absolutely no linguistic reason in terms of communicating an idea that we need to use it that way. So at first, I felt like, I don't know, I was a kid again, using the simple mi parolas, I speak, instead of I am speaking. But then, of course, after a while, I got used to it, and I actually decided I liked it better than English. So you overcome this in the end. But it influences every language. Like when you start speaking a new language with their word order and their conjugation or their grammar, however it is, it just sounds a little off. But over time, you start to, sort out that what is correct English is not correct Portuguese, is not correct Spanish, is not correct Chinese. And they all have logic that is internally sound, but none of it is externally better than any other languages. So the logic of English grammar is not more logical than the logic of Spanish grammar. They're just different. And you have to learn that as you learn the language. But another way in which this has really influenced my languages, and that I'm really struggling with, even now, because it's a much more subtle and much more subconscious process, is pronunciation. And I think in my own personal case, it also has to do with the fact that when I was a child, I had a speech impediment. And so I had years of speech therapy and of English teachers drilling this into my head. I can just hear them in the back of my head, enunciate, enunciate. But of course, what that means in English is to speak very clearly and very kind of deliberately each consonant sound. And in actual practice, we don't do that. But we're trained to do that in school because it improves our English speaking somewhat. That gets into a whole nother thing about prescriptive versus descriptive linguistics, and I'm not going to go there today. But the thing is, it absolutely does not apply to Portuguese, because Portuguese has a completely different phonetics and a completely different prosody. And especially European Portuguese, European Spanish, they have kind of a lispy sound to them. In the case of Portuguese, there's a lot of sh, 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 sh. It almost sounds like you're speaking while using mouthwash at the same time. And it's really hard to do that and to see that as making the correct sound when you have this internal conditioning from English teachers telling you, enunciate, make that sound more clear. And so this is the kind of linguistic biases that we confront as language learners, that we have to first consciously and then I think almost subconsciously learn to substitute a whole new set of rules for what sounds right, what sounds good, what sounds correct. And that is one of the challenges of learning a second language, but also I think one of the benefits, because we have a better view of our own grammar in our native language as well when we can see it kind of from the outside. Now, I said that I did have a little bit to say about the other kind of bias, which is kind of the social biases that we often have around class, race, ethnicity, that kind of thing. And I think there's a little bit of that too in learning a second language, especially coming from an English-speaking American, and probably even a little bit to a certain extent an English-speaking British person or Australian. British people live closer to Europe, so maybe they don't have quite the same issue. But like in America, there is definitely biases around Spanish, not just linguistic biases around Spanish and English, that English is the dominant language and in the minds of some people, very dominant. They get, angry. You can find videos on YouTube or Twitter or anywhere of Americans getting very angry when people don't speak English in their country or their grocery store, or I don't know. I don't know why they think it's theirs personally. It's 330 million people in the country and it's not yours. You're not the only one. But we're getting off track. So this kind of bias, when we look at Spanish in America, Spanish is a home language. It is a language that Latino people speak in their home or in the street. It's taught in schools as a second language, but it's almost never heard in the workplace as a professional language. It's almost never heard in education as the language of instruction. It's not, used in those capacities or in those spheres. And I think this is also important to especially explain why so many Americans, if they learn Spanish in high school and they learn a little bit, they don't speak it well. And you can see this if you look up any videos of all of the politicians. They'll go on a debate and they'll want to pander to the Spanish-speaking vote by throwing out a few words of Spanish or a sentence or here or there. But their pronunciation is terrible and their prosody is terrible. And I think it's because we don't perceive Spanish as, a professional language that a politician speaks. And so in our minds, even if we know the pronunciation and prosody of Spanish, and we know the pronunciation and prosody of English, the English takes a slightly higher spot in our mind because we see it as more of a prestige language. And that's another privilege or another bias that we have to break down in order to really be able to speak Spanish well or to speak Portuguese well, because it's the same thing. The Portuguese spoken in America is almost exclusively Brazilian immigrants, and it's almost exclusively like their home language that they speak with maybe older relatives, and it's very rarely the language of instruction or the language of the law or the language of politics in anywhere in North America. And so we need to break that down. So how do we do that? Some of it is time and repetition. I spend quite a bit of time reading aloud in Portuguese because I need all the help I can get with pronunciation and prosody and really embedding that in my mind and getting it at as deep of a level as the English rules of prosody are. But I also think it can help to approach the language in more spheres, like not to just accept the typical American idea that Spanish is an informal language, but to realize there's great literature in Spanish. There's nonfiction, so you can read science and all of the things you can read in medicine and all of the things you can read in English, you can read in Spanish. And it's great practice to learn a whole bunch of vocabulary that you won't find on YouTube videos, on Netflix shows, or reading, trashy novels. But it's also, I think, a great way to open your mind to the idea that it can be a very formal language as well, and it can be correct, very correct, and that can maybe help in your subconscious even things out. At least that's my theory right now. When I have fully mastered Portuguese, I will get back to you and say, yeah, this is exactly what finally got me over the hump. But I don't know yet. So that's my rant for today. If you've enjoyed it, give me a thumbs up. Subscribe if you enjoy listening to this kind of weird ranty stuff that I do. And see you in the next one.